And we're particularly honored to have Boris Kagarlitsky, who's coordinator of the Transnational Institute, Global Crisis Project, and director of the Institute of Globalization and Social Movements in Moscow. Dr. Kagarlitsky is a sociologist who has been a political dissident in the Soviet Union and in post-Soviet Russia. He is a public intellectual, and in 1990 was elected to the Moscow City Soviet and to the executive of the Socialist Party of Russia. He was arrested in 1993 for his opposition to President Boris Yeltsin, but was released the next day after international protests. Many of his articles are accessible on the internet, in online journals, and he has written a number of books, including Back in the USSR and Russia under Yeltsin and Putin.
Of course, now Russia is back in the news. That's the only encouraging aspect of the situation, because up to some point I had a feeling that in the West they were tending just to forget about Russia's existence. And only when the bad news is coming, the bad news from the point of view of the mainstream, the bad news from the point of view of the media, then Russia is getting back into the news, and at least it looks like there is some interest in what is happening there. However, I think that ironically, the problem is not so much with Russia, and not even with the conflict between Russia and the West, because that should be put into a much broader context. And today already we mentioned Syria as yet another country in crisis, but we didn't mention yet another country which is very important to the understanding of the current crisis in Europe, which is Greece. And again, if we are looking at the process, how it was developing in Southern Europe and then in Eastern Europe, you discover very important similarities which explain the actual momentum, the actual dynamic of the crisis which is taking place in Ukraine and which involves Russia. Because what we see is a gradual expansion of Western economic and political system in Europe. And of course, the first wave of expansion in the 1970s included the countries of Southern Europe into the system which was established as a political, economic, or rather geo-economic system around what later became the European Union. It was not yet there. The European Union emerged in its current form somewhat later, but basically the first expansion was the expansion of 1970s, and that expansion was quite generous in many ways, because Western Europe by then was still Keynesian, was somewhat social democratic, was still regulated, and the expansion of the 70s actually did lead to the countries of Southern Europe acquiring some benefits, acquiring some positive results. However, you should not forget that the major meaning of that expansion was not about making people, say, in Spain, Greece, or Portugal happy. It was about involving these countries and integrating them into the new division of labor, and integrating them into the process of capital accumulation and concentration of resources, which in the long run benefited the traditional countries of the core of the capitalist system, such as, of course, in Europe, Germany and France, to some extent Britain, but of course, at the global level, that was the United States. However, next wave of expansion, which was taking place in the 1990s, was by far less generous, because during that period of time, the European Union already transformed itself into an open and neoliberal structure. And by the way, if you are following the legislation which was developed and the treaties, the Maastricht Treaty and the Lisbon Treaty, what was the actual meaning of these documents? The actual meaning of these documents was about transforming Europe into a neoliberal empire, basically. That is a very clear thing. And also another very important point, the structures of Maastricht Europe are developed in such a way that they consciously and deliberately designed to make social democratic policies impossible. Not only radical leftist politics or environmentalist politics or whatever, any kind of radical change. It's not even about radical change. It's not only blocking any type of radical change, actually making it kind of illegal within the framework of the European Union as it is emerging now. But it's also even creating the situation when any country which will try to practice any sort of social democratic policies beyond certain level, beyond certain red line, is actually going to be punished. And that's also part of the legislation. It's not just the policy, it's part of the legislation, it's an institutional element of the system. So the next wave of expansion was into Eastern Europe, and of course it had a few aspects. One aspect was the expansion of NATO. And by the way, I think Sergei will be probably going into more details discussing that, but at least we in Russia remember that Americans and Western Europeans promised that NATO was not going to expand to the east. And in fact, if you're looking at the map, you discover that it moved quite a lot to the east. But it was not so much about geopolitics, because the arrangement was not only about integrating some Eastern European countries into the European Union, as it happened later, or into NATO, as it also happened, but it was also about integrating Ukraine, Russia, Kazakhstan, and Moldova, and a few other countries into the same system of capitalist division of labor, but this time already in its neoliberal phase. So it's very important, the difference between what was happening in the 1970s, the first expansion and the second expansion. First expansion was still more or less social democratic, more or less generous, while the second was not. It was a very aggressive neoliberal expansion, which was based on the logic of the so-called free market. However, in both cases, in the case of the 1970s and in the case of 1990s, there was one very important similarity. Both arrangements were based on the same principle. On the one hand, in terms of integrating these countries into capitalist world system, these countries had to do what they were offered or ordered to do in terms of providing the resources, providing the commodities, providing the opportunities for the global market for multinational corporations and so on. That was very clear. However, the second segment of that arrangement, whether it was Greece or Spain or Ukraine or Russia or Moldova or Romania or whatever, was that the political control and social control domestically remained in the hands of local elites. So as long as you provide necessary commodities, as long as you provide everything we need from you within the global division of labor, as long as you integrate your economies and make them element of the global process of accumulation of capital, you, local elites, are allowed to do in your own societies whatever you want. You're quite free and you're in control, and property stays with you. This is also very important within capitalism. And by the way, that also explains why politically the West was not so keen actually on really defending democracy in these countries. Because, of course, well, there was a lot of talk about democratic transit. But when President Yeltsin dissolved the parliament and then sent the tanks to shell the parliament building, what was happening? Did they accuse Yeltsin of being a tyrant? Not at all. They applauded that as a triumph of democracy. And, well, you know, poor Putin never came any close to that. And still, he's now described as a tyrant, as a dictator, and so on. So, however, it is not just about hypocrisy. Of course, there was a lot of hypocrisy. But it's not just about hypocrisy, it's about the arrangement. As long as it is part of your kind of business, in your country, you do whatever you want and we will cover up or turn blind eye on what you are doing. However, the situation started changing with the economic crisis. The more difficulties were emerging, the more problems were kind of appearing, and the more Western elites were going to face the consequences of their own policies, the more they started getting aggressive. And we already here have spoken about Great Victorian Depression. I think it's a very interesting parallel, a very interesting comparison, because one of the problems of the Great Victorian Depression, one of the problems of the current neoliberal system, is that on one hand, the policy of the capitalist elites is to press down wages in the core countries and dismantle or limit welfare state. So undo as much as you can. Well, in the case of Great Victorian Depression, welfare state simply did not exist yet. In the case of neoliberalism, it is gradually dismantled, gradually deconstructed. So that anyhow, the logic is the same. The logic which was described in traditional classical Marxism, the logic of pressing down wages and pressing down so-called social expenditure. But the problem is that it also leads to markets being undermined. Because when you press down wages, you end up with no one being capable of buying anything. And of course, you can try to solve this problem with credit, but you end up with bubbles. So that's what we all know. And the only solution in such situations is to expand the system, to take over more markets, to take over more resources, and not only to take them over, but to take them over cheaply. Best to conquer them. So that sense, late Victorian Depression led to the expansion of colonialism, new colonial conquests. And the countries which were not of great interest to the capitalist core all of a sudden started getting attacked. However, today we are in a different world, and big colonial empires don't exist anymore. However, the logic is very similar. And within this logic, the West actually has to revisit the countries which were already organized and integrated into the system, and kind of integrate them anew, changing the arrangements, changing the rules of the game. And what's the new rule of the game? The new rule of the game is basically, okay, you did a good job integrating your economies into the world system, but the initial arrangement was that your elites were to stay in power, to stay in control, and to keep the property, and thus to keep much of the financial flows, the resources under their control, and so on. Not anymore. Not anymore. Now, that is going to be replaced by some kind of direct rule. So the property, the control, the actual management of the process will not be in the hands of local elites anymore. It must be shifted to the hands of multinational corporations and people who represent these corporations directly. And this is definitely a new colonial kind of approach. So from some kind of arrangement, from a compromise to a new colonial approach. That's where the process leads. And we saw that very clearly in Greece. In Greece, it's happening through the debt crisis. In case of Ukraine, it's happening through the political crisis, and we also see very clearly that the same dynamic, the same momentum is there. And actually, Russian elites, they understood that they're next on the hit list. They're not idiots. If you're looking at what's happening in Greece, what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening all around the world, they understand where they are definitely already on the list. And by the way, it's very interesting how all of a sudden Western media started speaking about oligarchs, about corruption, about the lack of democracy in these countries. It's very interesting. Because, you know, sometimes I have a feeling that some of the mainstream right-wing conservative commentators, they spent a lot of time recently rereading some of the leftist leaflets from East Central Europe of 10 years ago. Because what they're saying now is what we used to say like 10 years ago, and which we are actually in many ways keeping saying. But there is one difference. When they say, okay, you have to get rid of the oligarchy, we have to get rid of corruption and so on, is it because they want these countries to be more socially just or more democratic or more free? No. It's only because they want to take everything into their own hands. Get rid of the old oligarchs to replace them with the direct rule of multinational corporations. And this is very logical in a way. I can even imagine that probably in the capital sense these neoliberal multinational corporations will be even a bit more efficient and better organized and less corrupt than Russian or Ukrainian or Greek elites. The point is that what will be the meaning of this efficiency? It will probably mean that they will extract the resources from these countries even more effectively than the previous elites. That's all they're going to get. So that's one side of the story. The other side of the story is how Russian elites reacted to that. And, we will probably have to discuss Ukraine in more detail, but now we are speaking about more general topics, and if there will be more questions about Ukrainian crisis as such, it's a different story, but we can go into detail. But the important thing is, again, Russia is presented in the West as a kind of dictatorship or tyrannic country with just one guy running every show, which is total nonsense. First of all, it's technically impossible, even if we take real dictatorships. Yeah, they're not organized this way. It's very much this kind of Hollywood, or rather, it's not even Hollywood, it's Disney kind of presentation. Every time I'm reading what they write about Russia, I think it's more like Pink and Brain cartoon, you know. Why don't we conquer the world tomorrow, right? And this kind of logic. Just the bad guys running the show, period. On the contrary, the way Russian elite is organized is that they are, they bring together all kinds of stakeholders, all kinds of big corporations. They're not just oligarchs in the traditional sense, they're more like big corporations. Very much like in this country, very much like in the United States and so on. These corporations, they cooperate, and what is Putin is a great mediator. He's a compromise maker. He brings all these corporations, all these interest groups together. He considers their interests, their needs, and then, he tries to make everybody happy. And as long as all these elites are happy, everybody is doing well, and nobody's protesting, and the whole system runs very smoothly. But as long as you also have a lot of oil money, you can even consider those people who are not part of the deal, who are not part of the process. Because who are the ones who are not part of the process? These are somewhat 140 million people who live in the country, who are not part of this process. They're just outsiders, they're not directly represented. But don't think that the elite guys are so stupid. They know that there are another group of people of 140 million people in number. So as long as they get enough for themselves, then they also will take care of the remaining 140 million people. So, and as long as we did have oil money, Russian policies were in many ways unorthodox. So that Russian government was economically carrying out very neoliberal policies, including some privatizations going on, including the famous flat tax rate with no progressive taxation, which was abolished under Putin and so on and so on. However, in terms of social spending, Russian government was quite generous up to a point. So they spent quite a lot of money on healthcare, on education, and so on. By the way, probably they didn't spend this money right, because very often they invested money in the projects which actually, in practice, on the ground, made things worse rather than better. So this is another funny or not so funny phenomenon, that a lot of the money was allocated also according to the needs of particular bureaucracies, whether within the educational system or whether within the government system, and they did not think in the categories of actual social result. They saw that as a purely technical operation, and the outcome very often was disastrous. But still, having said that, I have to acknowledge the fact that social spending was actually growing rather than decreasing, and that it was accompanied with a growth of consumption. Again, it's another question whether more consumption is such a good news. As long as we are in the period of environmental crisis, well, we can have some second thoughts about that. However, still, for those people who were really impoverished in the 1990s, it was a tremendous progress. I just remember one Russian minister in the early 2000s, when things started improving, made a statement which, well, kind of impressed me. I didn't know whether I had to laugh or cry listening to that, because he said, a great majority of our citizens moved from misery to poverty. This is a progress. Well, actually, this is a progress. Who doubts? I mean, this is a progress. We progressed from misery to poverty in the early 2000s. But later, by the way, Russian society was really getting better. Living standards were really improving. So that also is one of the things which explains why the president is popular with the people. It's not that people are so zombified or brainwashed. They just know what was happening in the 90s and what was happening in the 2000s, and they can compare. And they're quite reasonable, and they're saying, okay, we don't want back into the 90s. So, finishing with two very important issues. So, Ukraine. The case of Ukraine is that, well, Ukrainian elites actually wanted to do basically the same as Russian elites. Every Ukrainian president tried to play Putin, even before Putin appeared in Russia. They wanted compromise between the elites, they wanted stability and so on. The problem was that they never succeeded. Why? Because they didn't have enough resources. They didn't have this oil, they didn't have this extra money coming to the country, and they were short of resources. So that led to the situation of a permanent conflict. In Russia, you had stability and consensus-making process. In Ukraine, every time they tried to compromise, they failed, and everything was falling apart time and again. And finally, we can go into details, but it's not so important. The important thing is that in 2014, the system simply collapsed. Once it collapsed, then the West moved in. And the West moved in a very direct way. And of course, what was happening on the Russian side, Russian elites started defending themselves because they saw Ukraine not only as a neighboring country where things were developing in a very negative way, but also as a platform from which further attack, not just military in NATO terms, but even more economically, is going to be undertaken on Russia. But that led them to a very odd situation when they are, on the one hand, pushed and pressed and forced to resist, to defend their national interests, to defend their country, to defend their state, and so on. But on the other hand, we have these people who are not fit to do that. These are all these people who have their, as it was said, property abroad, their children are abroad. They have all their loyalties, moral, psychological, cultural loyalties with the West. And the structure of their interests is such that they never manage to do anything but to deliver oil and gas and other materials to the global market. So they're totally dependent on the global market in terms of their structures of interest. So I think that is part of Western strategy, because then Western analysts think, okay, sooner or later we'll break these people. They will not be capable of really resisting. They will not be capable of fighting. These are not the ones who are really capable of protecting their country. And I think this is quite true. And I think what's happening right now, and I think here I'll probably almost going to pass the ball to Sergei. I think that this visit of Putin to New York in many ways was an attempt to make yet another compromise, to convince the West and convince Americans that they were doing certain wrong things which will not benefit anybody in the long run. And the kind of deal which they are offering seems quite logical. Okay, we will help you in Syria, we will help you against ISIS, and you will stop attacking us. You will stop putting pressure on us. You will recognize that we need each other. And from the point of view of Russian elites, it's totally logical. But the problem of this situation is that Russian elites, ironically, they idealize the West. And that's definitely, I think they miscalculate. They miscalculate because I'm not sure that the West, especially that the Americans, are interested in really fighting ISIS in the first place. And that's exactly why we see this strange schizophrenic kind of approach that they say, well, we have to fight ISIS, and simultaneously we have to fight Syrian government, which fights against ISIS. And again, Mr. Assad is no nice guy at all. It was a terrible government, actually, and it still is a terrible government in Syria. But the problem is that if your priority is to fight global terrorism, and your priority is to fight ISIS, then the only force on the ground which can resist ISIS is Syrian army, loyal to Mr. Assad, like it or not. Or maybe the reason behind the events is somewhat different. Maybe ISIS is not the main enemy. Maybe ISIS is the tool to undermine the traditional nationalist regimes in the Middle East. Well, of course, ISIS went out of control, it went too far. But still, even now, the main priority is not ISIS, it's not terrorism, it's something else. If it is so, then I think Russian leadership is in serious trouble, because they will not get what they wanted, they will not get this compromise. What will follow? I think there will be more conflict within Russian elite. There will be more conflict within elite, which will lead Russian society coming to the fore. Because at that point, people will start intervening in the process. And that is exactly what makes me optimistic. And, well, my colleague Anna Ochkina, a tremendous, excellent sociologist from Pilsen, she said that in a way Russian society is not awake. It's more like a sleeping beauty. And unfortunately nobody wants to kiss the sleeping beauty. But somehow I think they will make us wake up. Thank you.